In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Every year around this time, I do a Tolkien reread. I dive headfirst into a world that is so very different, but still technically our own. However, this time I am not doing it alone, as I have you guys to share it with, exploring a narrative that captures the very essence of what it means to discover yourself, and explore a world beyond your wildest imagination, whilst always feeling just like home. When first composing The Hobbit, Tolkien never knew the story would be connected to the tragic fall of Gondolin, or the dark life of Turin and Turambar. But nevertheless, the lines read at the beginning of this video serve as our introduction to their world, one which contains beings of immeasurable strength, craftsmanship never seen since, and magical creatures quite literally out of fairy tales. However, our eyes and ears into it are none of these. Rather, we first meet the most remarkably unremarkable creatures, hobbits, and one of the most, as they say, respectable of them all, a Baggins, Bilbo Baggins. What made a hobbit respectable was first and foremost predictability. It was stated that you could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. Therefore, there was nothing more unrespectable than something unpredictable. After all, why would one leave a quiet, happy life for one so full of risk? One where you don't know tomorrow nor today. It's the central question this story poses, and one our main character wrestles with throughout the narrative. Because whilst Bilbo may have been a Baggins in name, he was not entirely one in blood. His mother was the famous Belladonna Took, and the Tooks went on adventures. It's said that her great-great-granduncle was so large he could ride a horse, and in the famous Battle of Greenfields charged the goblin ranks, knocking their King Golfamble's head clean off with a wooden club and into a rabbit hole 100 feet away, winning the battle and inventing the game of golf at the same time. Yet Tolkien almost comically describes these traits in the manner a psychologist would a predisposition to mental illness, requiring a selection of criteria be met within a Took's life before symptoms began to manifest. And when one would disappear, the family would hush it up, attempting to avoid public scrutiny. In spite of this, Bilbo was known as a very well-to-do hobbit, one who never missed second breakfast nor did anything out of the ordinary. In fact, he described adventures as nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things, which make you late for dinner. It would appear that Bilbo takes very much after his father, or so one would think, because soon enough, that too would be put to the test. Gandalf's arrival in Bag End is perfectly chaotic, from the direct confrontation of Bilbo's good mornings to the patronizing manner in which he grants him his wish. The old wizard challenges our hobbit's mindset, and manages a breakthrough that even catches Bilbo off guard, giving him the confidence to leave a marking on the doors of Bag End for an unexpected party to arrive. The dwarves' arrival is a comedic mess, granting opportunities for iconic moments to shine, and serve as Bilbo's first real experience of the world surrounding his rather sheltered hole. The whole thing flusters him beyond degree, even culminating in a mini seizure near the end of the chapter. Yet it's during the performance of Misty Mountain's Cold that something rather Tookish woke up inside him, and he longed to see the great mountains, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. Though only fleeting, it's here where the transformation first begins, inevitably leading us to the challenge he must soon face. The Quest of Erebor is the archetypal fantasy adventure, one whose origins are found in Beowulf, and one from which many authors would draw inspiration. We hear through the accounts of both Gandalf and Thorin just how grave things have become since the sacking of their home at the hands of Smaug, and see firsthand many of the early world-building elements Tolkien already began to introduce, with the mentions of Moria, the necromancer, and even creatures known as were-worms residing in the last desert in the east of East, which in my headcanon are Tolkien's take on the legends of the Mongolian deathworms. It's during this interaction and the dwarves' misgiving at Bilbo's sudden fit that, in Tolkien's words, the Took side won, and Bilbo decides he's in. He throws out societal norms and resolves to go on an adventure which would be told of for generations to come, and would change the course of Middle-earth in more ways than one. If things couldn't get any worse for his reputation as a hobbit, from this point forward he becomes neither a warrior nor a scholar, but a burglar. It's in the following chapters that we see the ramifications of this decision, and perhaps some regrets, all while learning if Gandalf was truly correct when saying there's a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. The trek towards the last homely house wouldn't be an easy one, setting the tone for the remainder of the quest and presenting opportunities for both plot and character development. Upon leaving the borders of Hobbiton, the group immediately runs into trouble, and as the weather turns, they notice their resident wizard has gone missing. Gandalf's sudden disappearance primes the reader for his eventual departure, and the later interaction with trolls serves as a fun scene where the party's incompetence is put on full display without him. Bilbo's first attempt at burglary ends in complete disaster, and the relative ease at which the remainder of the group is captured recontextualizes the journey east. The dwarves expected a rather peaceful adventure as far as the long lake south of Dale, but an utter disaster this close to home undermines that belief, while simultaneously reasserting Gandalf's authority, as it was he who said the trouble would begin a long time before that, and it would be Gandalf who eventually rescues them, distracting the trolls till sunrise and turning them into stone. This interaction and the exploration of their hidden cave leads to the rediscovery of Glamdring and Orcrist, two incredibly famous swords of which many stories have been written and songs have been sung. In classic Tolkien fashion, however, the most important blade found amongst the ruins wasn't a sword at all, but a knife, forgotten by its owner, but claimed anew by a much smaller one. Its name? We'll get there soon enough, but first, we make a stop, one at the last homely house on the very borders of the wild. Rivendell marks the first true rest experienced since Hobbiton, and our first upfront introduction to the wider Legendarium, hearing of Gondolin and meeting Elrond, even getting hints of his half-elven heritage, a subtle reference to Eärendil and Elwing. His decipherment of the moon runes feeds bits and pieces of what to expect when eventually reaching the mountain, and Thorin's explanation of Durin's Day grants insight into the history of the dwarven race, further expanding on the importance of their quest as King Under the Mountain lays claim not only to Erebor's vast hoards of gold, but the rule over Durin's folk, one of the 7 kindreds of dwarves. The descent into the valley always evokes the most vivid of imagery, and the chapter serves as an excellent palate cleanser to prepare for the coming struggles. One of Tolkien's many strengths was ensuring believability within the confines of his world. While much of the stay with Elrond is spent feasting, sleeping, and overall recuperating, it serves this important purpose in doing so, as it's unrealistic to go on year-long adventures without a chance to replenish food, nor catch up on much-needed sleep, a fact which our author was hyper-aware of. After this short rest, the party faces their most dangerous path yet, crossing the Misty Mountains and entering into Wonderland. It's during this journey that an unlikely discovery is made. A hobbit comes into his own, and events unfold which shape the entirety of Middle-earth's trajectory. First, however, we must be introduced to a great mystery in Tolkien's world. The group's climb into the mountain is a difficult but rather peaceful one, only broken by the occasional boulder or strong wind. Several days in, however, the weather turns for the worst, and the party finds themselves caught amidst a severe thunderstorm, or as Tolkien describes, a thunder battle. Rocks begin to hurtle down the slopes around them, and as the party huddles beneath a shallow outcropping, many fear the strong winds will cast them to the valleys below. It's then During brief lightning flashes between crashes of thunder, Bilbo looks out and witnesses stone giants hurling rocks at another for sport. The experience marks the only direct appearance of giants throughout the entirety of Tolkien's completed novels, only further appearing as references by other characters or in early drafts later published by his son Christopher. They remain one of the great mysteries of Middle-earth, as the characterization of stone giants naturally implies other variants. They've been interpreted as everything from golem-like creatures to large humanoids. However, their origins remain unknown to this day, leaving one to wonder what other creatures may be lurking amongst the wild. Realizing the sudden danger they were in, the group sends two of its members, Fili and Kili, to search for better shelter from the storm, both of whom quickly return, claiming to have found an excellent cave in which the group can rest. Many are excited, yet Gandalf remains skeptical, knowing that caves up in the mountains were seldom unoccupied. A saying which is proven correct when goblins come pouring out a crack in the wall, stealing their supplies and taking the company captive. It's during this brief struggle that the first hints of Gandalf's greater power is revealed, as when goblins attempt to seize him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. What follows is yet another chaotic scene, in which the party finds themselves at the mercy of another, only to be rescued by Gandalf once again, as just before the Great Goblin attacks the group, he appears with Glamdring in hand, killing it and leading the group on a desperate race towards safety. However, it's during this, whilst being carried by Dory, a goblin jumps on top of them, and Bilbo plunges into utter darkness, hits his head on a rock, and remembers nothing more, bringing us to not only my favorite chapter in the entire novel, but one of the most important in all of Tolkien's work. Bilbo finds himself alone and afraid, in the depths of tunnels going back to ages before the goblins ever came and widened them, whose original owners are still slinking about, unbeknownst and unnamed. While desperately crawling on the floor towards what he can only hope is an escape, he comes across a cold piece of metal lying before him. Not a scrap, but jewelry. A ring, in fact. Tolkien would name it the turning point in his career, and the events that follow mark a change in our character, as he takes the first steps in transforming from a sheltered hobbit who never missed a second breakfast into something else entirely. Shortly thereafter, he encounters a large subterranean lake, in the center of which lives Gollum, a small, slimy creature, who long ago ventured into the heart of the Misty Mountains, never to return. And after a few tense moments, he's drawn into a game of riddles with the creature. The stakes are simple. Lose, he's eaten. Win, he'll get a present. Gollum's birthday present. With seemingly no other options, Bilbo agrees, kicking off one of the most memorable scenes in all of Tolkien's writings. Each riddle is more challenging than the next, and Bilbo is quickly overwhelmed by not only those posed, but the risk of being eaten that they carry. While approaching his wit's end, he fidgets with the ring, and not even thinking, asks aloud, "What have I got in my pocket?" It was, of course, not a riddle of any kind, but merely a question. However, Tolkien would later write, after accepting it and trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise, and after giving the three guesses of Hans's, knife, and string or nothing, he obliged. But upon returning to his island, it's of course nowhere to be found, because unbeknownst to Gollum, it was the very thing prompting Bilbo to ask the question to begin with, the very question which lost Gollum his ownership. One could even say it betrayed him. Gollum is beside himself, begging Bilbo's forgiveness several times and in recompense showing him the way out, ultimately leading to the chapter's conclusion and Bilbo's first successful escapade. Only, that's not how it occurred. What I just told you was a lie, a lie constructed by the Hobbit himself in an attempt to stake his claim on an object stolen from its current owner, and a lie that became so entrenched within the annals of history, it was included in the 1937 first edition of the very novel we're discussing today. An important aspect of Tolkien's work is that it's never presented as fictional stories, but sourced from ancient historical texts translated into English. The novel is called The Hobbit or There and Back Again because the latter was the name of Bilbo's first-hand account as written in the Red Book of Westmarch, named by Tolkien as his primary source. But any historian knows that even a primary source can sometimes still lie. In that case, what really did occur in that cave below the mountains? The ring is still in its original place, and a similar thing could be said about the game of Riddles. However, Bilbo's reward was always the way out. But when Gollum realized his birthday present was missing, he rather quickly made the connection as to just what's in that poor hobbit's pocket, triggering a desperate chase scene as Bilbo attempts to escape the enraged creature, accidentally slipping the ring on his finger and becoming invisible to the naked eye, at which point he follows Gollum to the nearest exit, nearly killing him then and there. But oddly enough, his complete and utter despair has a rather odd effect on Bilbo. An emotion wells up inside him, one which would go on to affect all of Middle-earth. Pity. Gollum is spared, and Bilbo leaps over the creature, making for the back door and leaving him inconsolable. The last words heard from Gollum are more of a scream, but read as such. Thief, thief, thief. Baggins. We hates it, we hates it, we hates it forever. The corrections were made in a second edition published in 1951, but the genius behind them wouldn't be revealed until 1954, as many were secretly necessary for the novel's upcoming sequel. Tolkien was able to use his own form of storytelling to turn what may have been a helpless blunder into one of the most remarkable pieces of world building I have ever seen. Riddles in the Dark remains my favorite chapter in the novel, and one of the most important in the entire Legendarium. But it also marks a turning point, as Bilbo and the party have made it through their most challenging test yet, now finding themselves facing Wilderland with no supplies, and soon enough, no wizard. But in return, they've received a once sheltered hobbit, armed with a newfound confidence, and a piece of equipment that will forever change their fate. The party's race through Wilderland gives us access to not only some incredible world building and character development, but also allows many of the childlike elements to shine within its frame, reminding us of Tolkien's core purpose with the narrative, in crafting a chaotic atmosphere ripe for the introduction of one of Middle-earth's most iconic creatures. Shortly after escaping the depths of the Misty Mountains, Bilbo comes across the remainder of the party in the midst of a heated discussion. It's here we see how much Gandalf truly cares for the Hobbit, insisting they go back and rescue him, and even threatening to leave the company stranded if they don't. The dwarves, however, disagree, openly questioning why he was even brought to begin with, claiming that he's been more trouble than use so far. And they aren't wrong. What exactly has Bilbo done since joining their company nearly 3 months ago? His burglary skills got the group captured by trolls, he's inexperienced in combat, and even had to be carried when escaping the goblins. Thus far, he's been nothing but an extra mouth to feed, who slows him down in every single circumstance. Yet it was Bilbo who warned Thorin of the trolls. It was Bilbo who alerted Gandalf to the ambush. And soon enough, it will be Bilbo who proves Gandalf's phrase, "If we can only find him again, you will thank me before all is over," correct. With the first step being his walking in on that very conversation, revealing to have escaped the goblins and simultaneously snuck past Balin standing guard. The dwarves' respect for him jumps tremendously, and it seems for the meantime they've been happily proven wrong. Yet it's Gandalf who, between laughter, shoots Bilbo a curious glance, guessing at what part of the story may have been left out. A thread Tolkien would later pull on to construct another of the greatest novels ever written. The later conflict with the wargs and goblins immediately sets the tone for what the party can expect in Wilderland. In lines such as Gandalf calling the goblins naughty boys who play with fire, calls the reader to the very conception of this narrative, one Tolkien told to his own children several years before publishing, and one that entranced myself as a child, as I'm sure it did many of you. The group finds themselves surrounded atop trees of pine as fire climbs up the trunks. Gandalf, seeing no other option, prepares a final stand. One can wonder how the final moments of Gandalf the Grey would have looked, surrounded by enemies and doing all he can to ensure others escape, but he never leaves. They're rescued by the great eagles of the northern Misty Mountains, introducing one of the most innately symbolic creatures in all of Middle-earth, carrying significant theological connotations both within the narrative and the wider world in which it resides. Criticism has long been lobbied against Tolkien for the inclusion of such creatures, as they can appear to be a lazy deus ex machina, appearing seemingly out of nowhere during times of strife, which, to be fair, is very much the case, because divine intervention is a core theme in Tolkien's work. In later books published by himself and his son Christopher would clarify the eagle's purpose in Middle-earth, recontextualizing this single event into a beautiful piece of storytelling. Diving into the history of Arda and its deeper meanings would be an extraordinary undertaking, but one I plan on accepting at a later date. Here, that theme is ever present, and the quest for Erebor has been revealed to be of far more importance than the company themselves ever realized. Regardless of that, they're now hungry, wary, and in desperate need of supplies, all of which can be solved at a rather homely house with a not so homely host. The party arrives at the residence of Beorn, a skin changer who morphs between the forms of a huge black bear and a large black-haired man. His true origins are unknown, but Gandalf provides two different accounts for a possible backstory. One where he's descended from the ancient bears of the mountains, and one where he's of the men residing in the region. Gandalf himself would lend more credence to the latter, but since no concrete answer is ever given, we're left only to wonder, highlighting another of Tolkien's greatest strengths. Many of my favorite stories contain incredibly complex worlds, and as a fan, it can be tempting to seek answers for every possible backstory. But Tolkien knew that those mysteries are exactly what drove the reader's intrigue, and therefore ensured that they remained as ones. He always approached the narrative as an outsider, famously responding to questions with speculation of his own, or even, "I don't know," not only maintaining the authenticity of his presentation, but the magic that comes with it. However, the most important aspect of this chapter is not who we meet, but who's lost in the process, as, in its conclusion, Gandalf departs, and with him, any sense of security. The company's left at the edge of Mirkwood, a forlorn region east of the Misty Mountains, and facing their most dangerous journey yet. Food will run low, and water will run lower, but they can't stop now, because this immovable fortress is the final obstacle before the Long Lake, and therefore the final obstacle before Erebor. They're left with simple advice: don't leave the path. And as the company issues forth, the only question on their mind is what exactly awaits. Their days are spent following a beaten down path under never-ending dusk, and their nights huddled together in everlasting terror. It gets dark in the forest, so dark that you can't see your hand in front of you, and so dark that the only beams of light are from the eyes that surround you. Mirkwood is far beyond a physical obstacle. It is the embodiment of fear, horror, and hopelessness. Each step is a hammer to the party's resolve. But each moment they don't, their supplies steadily dwindle. If not for the careful advice of Beorn, they would have surely fallen victim to the enchanted river. But even with their planning, Bombur falls in, and hope slowly runs dry. Tolkien would clarify that the white deer encountered was a sign they were nearing the eastern edge, and when Bilbo climbed the trees, they were simply in a valley, obscuring his sight, both of which would have been known if they simply pressed on a little further. But no, when an opportunity arises, they refuse to heed the most basic of advice, and just like that, they're lost. Mirkwood never presented a direct danger. In fact, Tolkien even stated that when the eyes were surrounding them, the creatures refused to venture within the light. And Bombur's falling was a simple loss of balance. It's only when the group is most vulnerable, with their will finally broken, do the inhabitants move in. The party's attacked by a horde of large spiders, and before anyone can fight back, they're wrapped up and taken off as prey. Everyone except one. Throughout the entire narrative, continuous hints have been dropped at Bilbo's eventual transformation. And here is where it finally pays off. Through the clever use of his newfound ring and natural ability to rhyme, the once sheltered hobbit successfully drives the spiders away, rescuing his friends, and for the first time, coming into his own. These spiders, however, have a different reaction. They don't see a hobbit running around with a dagger. They don't even know what a hobbit is. They just know that something is moving around with a sting of its own to rival theirs. And it's from this that the once forgotten elvish blade is given its name, Sting. Soon enough, the party's thankful for their rescue, but realize they have no supplies, a hard road ahead, and an even harder one behind, leaving no option but to move forward. It's only after settling down for a long night's rest that somebody asks, "Where's Thorin?" And suddenly, they're in a panic. Thorin is residing in the dungeons of the Elven King, and soon enough, the rest will be there with him. The final line in Flies and Spiders reads, "But that belongs to the next chapter, in the beginning of another adventure in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness," highlighting the rather different format of this novel in comparison to Tolkien's later works. The Hobbit was written and presented in small bites, many stories which came together to form a singular narrative, and we find ourselves in the crux of one as Bilbo must rise to the occasion and prove himself once more. He describes himself as a burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day, displaying the uniquely different type of heroism Tolkien presents. Bilbo embarked on a historic quest to liberate an ancestral home, but one where he violates preconceived notions of right and wrong, shrinking himself down from a respectable hobbit to the lowly position of burglar. Bilbo's virtue is not one of outward conformity, but inward nobility, holding steadfast to one's beliefs even when authority figures disagree, and putting yourself in the crosshairs of persecution if it means others can escape. Bilbo spends his nights hiding in dark corners and stealing from the tables of the Elven King, but doing so in order to rescue those who saved him in more ways than one. Tolkien poses a possible motivation for Gandalf's departure being a test of faith. He said to trust the Hobbit completely, and it's this conflict which would finally cement Bilbo's usefulness, not only in the company's mind, but his own. After hearing how he rescued the party from the spiders, Thorin is ready to listen, but Bilbo doesn't feel as hopeful. He instead feels the weight of the world on his shoulders, and worries the pressure will be too much for him. It's here the question of persistence comes in. The company was already tested in Mirkwood, failing completely. But the Elven King's Halls grants a chance for redemption, and a chance for Bilbo to pass the test laid at his feet, proving that there's a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. Soon after, he discovers a trapdoor on the lower level, used to dump empty barrels into the river as a means of trade, and rather quickly, a plan begins to form. Before long, 13 dwarves are stuffed in barrels, floating down the river, successfully escaping the clutches of Mirkwood, and on a straight path towards the end of their journey. The arrival in Lake Town is marked by cheer, warmth, and even some hysteria. When Thorn declares himself, some sprint out of their halls as if the mountain itself would be flowing with gold, while many more, including the master himself, take a far more skeptical approach. However, what makes the scenario unique is that while the former may appear significantly more ridiculous, it's the latter which proves to be the more ignorant reaction. In a letter to Amy Ronald in 1956, Tolkien wrote the following: "I am a Christian, and indeed a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some samples or glimpses of final victory." The long defeat is a Christian theological concept, more specifically in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, concerning the ever-losing battle against the sin of man. In an article on the matter, Father Stephen Freeman compares the concept to evolution, pointing out that adaptations of a species aren't necessarily progress as we'd imagine it, but simply a product of the environment, meaning that if the world is already corrupt, then the church is in an everlasting combat against the forces of natural selection in a fallen world, a battle which will be inevitably lost, as the history of evolution clearly proves. For those familiar with Tolkien's work, I'm sure you've already begun making the connections, as this concept is an ever-present theme in not only The Hobbit, but every aspect of the Legendarium, most often appearing not in forms of conspiracy, but complacency. Complacency leading to arrogance, and arrogance leading to destruction. Individuals throughout Lake Town whose ancestors fled the Great Worm's flames openly doubt its existence, while guards spend their nights drinking, and the master seeks only to further his political position above preparing for the inherent risk Thror's heir carries. Within the party itself, the issue is pronounced tenfold. Many of the dwarves quickly become caught up in the celebration, acting as if the gold is already theirs, and Smaug already vanquished. Tolkien writes of a grand departure created for the company, describing as they sailed up the river running on a cool autumn morning. Everyone was in high spirits. All save one. Only Bilbo seems to comprehend their reality. No amount of well wishes, extra food, or fresh weapons will prepare them for the being they'll soon face, and any belief that it will is coated with a level of arrogance that Tolkien does not shy away from, an arrogance that, as I've stated, can lead to destruction, as they sail head first to meet a monster which will burn their world to the ground without a second glance. The journey to Erebor is a somber one. With every inch closer to the desolation, the dread sets in. The joy of Lake Town seems years behind them, but the stories of Smaug from centuries past rings fresh in their minds. For the first time, Bilbo looks upon the ruins of Dale, a bare and lifeless place, while hearing stories of rich green mountainsides from the mouth of someone who witnessed its destruction. Though I unfortunately cannot remember who first described it, I'm reminded of a saying referencing the incalculable weight of the past in relation to Tolkien's world. Every piece of his narratives are filled with an everlasting foreboding presence of nostalgia. Nostalgia for elder days when the world was yet unmarred. and one could freely roam without fear of being assailed. However, diving into the history of Arda reveals a past to be just as evil as the present, with current foes being nothing but a mere shadow of those who came before, calling to question how often we should be looking back, and how today should be treated with the circumstances we were given. A theme only further explored in a sequel published 20 years after this one. It seems rather ironic. Among all the danger the company is moving towards, a locked door nearly breaks them. Yet it serves the purpose of providing a calm before the storm, and a moment's peace before facing their task. With Bilbo sitting on the doorstep, thoughts filled not of how to solve their problem, but his hobbit hole back home, and the comfort it would bring. As the waning of autumn approaches, the keyhole would reveal itself, calling back to the words once read in the quiet, peaceful house of Elrond, many months back. But that is now miles behind them, and this moment, a task is laid before them, as a path is revealed into the heart of a mountain holding a being of immeasurable strength and endless greed. A once grand kingdom now transformed into hell on earth, and it's Bilbo who must now walk in on living feet. He makes his way through a hall ever slanted downward. With every step taken, the temperature begins to rise, and after a while, a soft red glow could be seen ahead. It would be here that Bilbo paused, taking in his surroundings and coming to terms with the situation. Tolkien would comment that moving from there was the bravest thing he ever did. However, I want to ask why Bilbo is braving this journey alone to begin with, and our answer is given in the beginning of this chapter, paired with a statement that would recontextualize the quest of Erebor and set the tone for its conclusion. When Bilbo asked if anyone would be willing to venture into the Inferno, none came forward, save Balin, who offered to go halfway and call for help if needed. Following this interaction, Tolkien makes a statement. There it is. Dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. Some are not, but are decent enough people like Thorin and company. If you don't expect too much. If you don't expect too much. Among a party of hardened dwarves running with the blood of kings, a Baggins of Hobbiton is the bravest among them. That bravery pushed Bilbo down the tunnel and brought him eventually to look upon the great worm residing there for 171 years. Smaug is the embodiment of greed, holding a hoard so vast he could never possibly use it, but knowing every bit of his wealth inside and out. He is the base by which Tolkien built the affliction of greed within his world, an affliction so persistent in its appearance and effects throughout history that the professor even granted it a name: dragon sickness. An illness of the mind brought on by the incredible pull of wealth on even the most noble of figures, and an illness based on a being so filled with greed, it noticed a single cup missing in its endless mounds of treasure. Soon enough, its effects beset all involved, as we see who rises to its challenge and who falls to its pull. The conversation between Bilbo and the Drake is one of logic and temptation, as Smaug attempts to sow division, openly questioning Thorin's motivations whilst filling Bilbo's mind with insecurities. Yet the Hobbit remains firm, disguising his identity through riddles and tricking the dragon into revealing a chink in his impenetrable hide. It's during this conversation, however, Bilbo slips up, naming himself Barrel Rider, which Smaug immediately connects to the men of Lake Town, and soon enough sets off in fire to burn their world to the ground. They provided their aid to the king under the mountain, and this is how they'll be repaid. The party's exploration of an abandoned Erebor serves as a calm before the storm, presenting opportunities for valuable world building and questioning the motivations of characters involved. It would be Bilbo who first suggests that the party explores the mountain, and it's Bilbo who they observe climb through hordes of gold, whilst they huddle in the darkness, during which he paused, staring at the ground, but for what reason, they didn't know. It was the Arkenstone of Thrain, the heart of the mountain and an heirloom of Durin's folk, glowing with its own inner light, yet carved by the dwarves in such a manner that all light shone on it would be reflected into thousands of radiant white sparks with hints of rainbows. Bilbo is a naturally sympathetic character. He serves as our eyes and ears, saves his friends in times of need, and can be incredibly relatable with his rather matter-of-fact nature. Yet we've already seen how temptations affect him with the ring, and now he is standing face to face with the most valuable gem since the Silmarils, with a decision laid at his feet. What does he do? He takes it. Why? Because he wants to. We know its eventual purpose, but at this point, Thorin hasn't shown any outward signs of dragon sickness. There's no conflict by which a valuable trade can solve, and in fact, the company doesn't even yet know where Smaug is. There's still the real possibility they'll have to flee with nothing to show but what they grab now. Yet Bilbo takes the Arkenstone and hides it. He knows how much it means to Thorin, and he knows it will cause problems in the future. But even the most down-to-earth people can be ensnared by the power of greed. The events pull back the veil in a similar but albeit less impactful manner than that of the ring, only further emphasized when Thorin gifts him a mithril coat, later named to be worth more than the entirety of the Shire. But Bilbo stays quiet. However, an important virtue this story presents is the overcoming of desires that plague us all, and soon enough, we'll see that in action, proving once again that hobbits are much more resilient than first appear. However, amongst all of this, a single question looms. Where's Smaug? Similarly to how I described the Half-Blood Prince's conclusion in my Harry Potter video, the scene of Lake Town realizing a dragon's on its way, paired with the blasts of warning trumpets and the scrambling of men to arms, will always give me goosebumps, as we're given a modern rendition of a classic tale, one where a town is under siege as men fight valiantly against a seemingly unstoppable force, not in the hopes they can win, but to buy time for the most vulnerable to escape. An ever-common story throughout our own history, and one Tolkien was hyper-aware of. The men of Esgaroth were protected by the fact they'd built their town on the lake itself. As Tolkien would state, the lake was mightier than he. It would quench him before he could pass through. However, no level of security can prevent fear from taking hold, and the soldiers would have long fled if not for Bard, the bowman, a descendant of the Lord Girion of Dale, running to and fro, encouraging men to fight to the very last arrow. Yet even still, hopelessness took hold. Weapons were thrown down, the master attempted to sail off, and those who once praised the dwarves now cursed their name. But Bard's archers held firm, protecting their home until all was lost. If Smaug was the embodiment of greed, Bard is that of bravery, refusing to back down even when all his men deserted him. He's the closest thing we get to a traditional archetypal hero, and upon hearing of the weak spot from the very thrush who overheard Bilbo tell of it, he would notch a black arrow, one which had never missed its mark, and long been recovered, declaring that if you ever came from the forges of the true king under the mountain, go now and speed well. The death of Smaug is a bittersweet one. The great worm lay vanquished beneath the depths of the long lake. Yet Esgaroth is in ruin, and those who survived are now cold, starving, and in desperate need of shelter. The elven king of Mirkwood would render aid soon enough, yet it would carry a different undertone than mere kindness of heart. The legends of Thor's wealth had not been forgotten, but the dragon is dead. Erebor is free for the taking, and soon all of Middle-earth will hear. Our party would learn of Smaug's demise thanks to Roak, Kark's son, an aged raven who relayed the information learned from the very thrush who advised Bard. However, what makes the moment unique is how quickly the dwarves turn from immense joy to sudden paranoia, as the company learns of not only Esgaroth's plight, but the Elven King who will soon join them. Roak would advise Thorin to seek peace, even if it meant parting with some of his gold. Yet the king declares no thieves will touch his hoard, and asks to send aid for his cousin Dane in the Iron Hills, hoping an army can be rallied. The dragon may be dead, but its sickness remains, and already sinks its claws into the air of Durin's folk. The following pages covering the arrival of the combined host and eventual siege of Erebor stands as a stellar example of how greed can corrupt, not because of any brutality or vitriol, but how one-sided it is. While the dwarves lay in dark thoughts of their mountain being sacked, the elves play sweet music and render aid to those in need. When Bard approaches the fortified gate, he's not seeking plunder, but fair compensation for the aid Laketown rendered, and access to the wealth of his own forefathers to rebuild the city of Dale. But Thorin refuses to hear reason, opting to fire an arrow at a later messenger, leading to a siege not of conquest, but of last resort to convince a dwarf who cannot hear reason. Rather ironically, in his paranoia and attempts to prevent a war, Thorin may have led to its very creation. Most of the company would side with their king, reasonably believing that they can hold out for aid from the Iron Hills, opting for open combat amongst the ruins rather than part with little gold. In response, Bilbo declares a place to stink of dragon, and he'd be correct in more ways than one. Yet amongst his complaints, a plan begins to form, not born from betrayal, but much like the siege itself, desperation. With every day that passes, Thorin becomes increasingly afflicted, having his company spend their days sorting the mountains of gold, while anxiously awaiting news from his kin in the east. Soon enough, Roak would confirm that Dane is only a 2 days' march away, with an army of 500 dwarves at his back. Thorin waited 171 years to return, but in his greed, he would rather risk hundreds of kin and his very seat of power than render aid. That night, however, a hobbit would scuttle down a rope from the gates of Erebor, and soon enough be sitting amongst a party of men and elves, presenting the Arkenstone in his hands. I previously referenced the kind of heroism Tolkien presented, discussing Bilbo's refusal to abandon his friends and the strength of his resolve. However, it takes a different kind of resilience to not only stand up to oppressive elven kings, but a close friend as well. In doing so by not only parting with the most valuable gem since the Silmarils, but his 1/14th share, all in the hopes that a peaceful resolution can be reached, and no more bloodshed is necessary. Gandalf's reappearance only further reinforces the correct decision, and the plan to exchange the Arkenstone for a 14th share of the gold is both bold in its attempt and satisfying in its creation. Amongst all else, Thorin coveted the Arkenstone of Thrain, and now that very heirloom is to be used against him. As Bard approaches the following morning and offers the exchange, the dragon sickness enacts full control. If not for Gandalf's intervention, Bilbo would have been cast to the jagged rocks below, as the wrath of Thorin is kindled to its greatest degree. He agrees to make the trade, but swears to never have dealings with wizards so long as he lives, and refers to Bilbo as a descendant of rats. Tolkien, however, would write that the treasure had such a sway on the king that already he began to scheme on how he might secure the stone whilst parting with none of it. This interaction provides the most front-facing commentary on the detrimental effects of greed in the entire novel, as we witness an individual whom Bilbo risked his life for and supported on a near hopeless journey turn on him the moment his fortune is at risk. Tolkien was born in 1892, at the tail end of the Victorian era in Great Britain. However, across the pond, it would have a different name: the Gilded Age, a period of American history in which titans of industry dominated every aspect of society, from the government to the school system. Something in this era that always fascinated me was the psychology of it. How men who were seemingly loving husbands, fathers, and community members could become the most ruthless, heartless individuals when money became involved. I often question how much of the behavior was nature versus nurture, how much was innate drive, and how much was the compounding effects of the immense wealth involved. Tolkien always preferred applicability to allegory, and the more I analyze our history, the more these lessons become apparent. The following morning, as the sun rose across the pale eastern sky, runners would arrive in Dale, warning of a great dwarvish host rounding the lonely mountain. Dane had come at last, and with him, war on the horizon. Bows twanged and battle began, but darkness quickly fell, as the voice of Gandalf cried out in a thunderous roar, "Halt! Dread has come upon you all. Alas, it has come more swiftly than I guessed. The goblins are upon you." News had spread faster than even the wise expected, and under the shadow of the Grey Mountains, a foe far worse than greed had come to their very doorstep. The goblins' arrival is the wake-up call for our heroes, a force which lays the pettiness of their squabbles bare and forces a decision of unification or destruction. The conflict is later dubbed the Battle of the Five Armies, as men, elves, and the kindred of Durin set aside their differences to face the greater threat. Reminiscent of the last alliance, established nearly 3,000 years prior, and calling to mind times within our own history where unlikely alliances came from dire circumstances, with even Thorin's company issuing forth from Erebor to stand beside their kindred in a battle for their home. The scene not only serves as a poetic alliance and climactic conclusion, but also as a presentation of Tolkien's perspective on human nature and the relative faith he had. I think an apt comparison would be the Long Night in A Song of Ice and Fire. Though the conflict has not yet been reached by George Martin in his writings, I don't believe it's a long shot to assume that a uniting of Westeros would not occur, a difference only further reinforced with the reappearance of the Eagles, ensuring that the battle is won and displaying to those involved that in spite of their missteps, God has not abandoned them. It would be whilst cheering this revelation that a stone came hurtling from above, smote Bilbo's helm, and he remembered nothing more. The Battle of the Five Armies is one of divine and cooperative justice against a force which threatens to upend the entire system they fight over. It calls back to historic alliances in our own history and poses the question of what would happen if the same occurred to us. Would we unite or remain divided and become conquered? Bilbo would be found the following morning by a scout of Dale and carried back to the camp in a cheery mood, realizing the battle had been won. However, that short-term joy would be ripped to shreds upon his discovery of Thorin's fate, walking in with Gandalf to find him barely clinging to life, as it's revealed that during the battle, Thorin was pierced by many spears, but not before both Fili and Kili fell defending their king. It's a bittersweet end, as Thorin sees the errors of his ways, begging forgiveness for all his misdoings, and uttering the most impactful Tolkien quote I've ever read. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. Thorin would pass shortly thereafter, but in his death transforms from a greed-stricken monarch into the embodiment of what a leader should be. Someone who's willing to lay down their life for those they're ordered to protect. The king would be laid to rest beneath the mountain, with the Arkenstone on his breast and Orcrist on his tomb, to remain until the mountain falls and the world is renewed. Dain took up the seat of king under the mountain, and was, by all accounts, a great monarch who dealt the treasure well, never succumbing to its pull, knowing firsthand the dangers it presented. The rest of the company would remain in Erebor, staying to rebuild their ancestral home and right the wrongs committed. What we are left with is a forever changed hobbit, one who intimately knows the dangers of greed, understands the importance of friendship, and experienced bravery in its truest form, but most importantly, knows that there's a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. He just needed an adventure. Soon enough, he begins his homeward journey, thinking the Tukish side to be rather expended, and excited to let the Baggins take over once more. The journey home is characterized by the peace and prosperity long earned by the story told, and the contrast between an ever-changed hobbit and a never-changed hobbiton acts as a benchmark, displaying just how far our characters come, with the final comedic act of Bilbo walking in on his own estate sale becoming one of the most iconic moments in the entire novel. The final time jump and arrival of Balin some years later ties off many loose ends presented in the narrative, wrapping everything up quite nicely. Yet even still, we're left with a last lesson of greed, as Balin reveals the master of Lake Town to have fallen under dragon sickness, stealing the gold gifted for his people and dying in the wilderness. The novel ends with a joke by Bilbo about the prophecies of old, but it's the response by Gandalf that we're left to sit with. Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you. But you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world, after all. Thank goodness, said Bilbo laughing, and handed him the tobacco jar. The Hobbit is a story of self-transformation, rejection of societal norms, the effects of greed on the most noble of beings, and the importance of holding to one's morals, even when it hurts. J.R.R. Tolkien utilized the story as a launching point into the greatest legendarium ever created, filled with some of the most profound stories I have ever read, and defining Western fantasy for generations to come. However, what makes it so remarkable is not the complexity of its themes, but the simplicity of its presentation. Tolkien's goal was to write a children's tale, sharing lessons learned through a timeless narrative conceived not in the halls of academia, but the bedside at night, meaning that above all else, through societal commentary and lessons of morality, it will always feel just like home. Thank you for watching.